Without further ado, I would like to bring up my friend and business partner. I'm so grateful for him, Ray Waldrup.
All right, I might need 15 minutes to gather myself after that. But, well, again, welcome everyone. And like Mike said, we want this to be very meaningful. We want it to be open discussion. You know, I've told groups for years and years and years. I've been to so many practices. I've benchmarked practices. And I say always, the problems are the same, the names and faces are different. So you think you have some unique problems, you really don't. They're pretty much the same all the way around. So I want to get started by, how we got to where we are now. What has happened in the last 4 or 5 years in rheumatology and why that's important. Brent Flickinger teases me all the time about these Rayisms that I have. And, one of these founding principles of business is you can't improve what you can't measure. So if you don't know what's going on in your practice, how in the world are you going to improve it? So hopefully we'll be able to help you guys with some things here. And today's agenda, or this talk's agenda, we'll just look at landscapes. I won't bore you with a lot of this, but we'll just kind of dive right into it. So over the last 4 or 5 years, what's really changed in rheumatology and actually in medicine, period, and in other specialties, other industries. Since COVID, prices of everything went up. Our rents went up, our employee costs went up, supplies, everything went up. The only thing that didn't go up along with that was our contracts with our payers. So how do you offset that cost, that loss, I should say? Infusion margin compression, and I think the best way for us to look at this and understand it, if you go back to, let's say, 2021, 20, somewhere in there, I think Symphony Aria was around $1,000 a vial. Okay, well now it's less than 500. Okay, our profit margin is half of that. Our gross margin is still the same. So let's say, Symphony Aria has a 17% rebate for people who have the kind of volume to get to it. But let's just, for comparison, let's say it's a 10% margin. So on a $1,000 vial, we were making $100. Well, now it's a $480 vial. We're making $48. Our expenses have gone up. We're paying our nurses more, and so our margin is strong. Our profit is strong. Medicare Growth Advantage, I think a lot of people have not really thought this out clearly, but in 2020, only 34% were on Medicare Advantage plans. Now it's 54%. So how does that affect us? Okay, number one is, if any of you have had to look at a Medicare Advantage contract, all of them hit you starting at about 80% of Medicare. So they want you to take a hit right then. And then if you don't have someone who's a good negotiator and can make that over Medicare, which we've done for a lot of clients, then you're kind of in trouble. Then you think, okay, well, my patients are moving to this plan. I've got to accept it to take care of my patients. You sign the contract, and now you just cut your income from that to 20%. If you sign it at 80%. The other thing that a lot of groups aren't thinking about is you've taken patients off, or they've taken patients off Medicare, traditional Medicare. You can't infuse those patients anymore. Now they're on Advantage plans. How do they get their drug? So that's an issue. We all know about that issue, but when you put it in context this way, this is why a lot of our income has been shrinking. And then, the administrative burden. Now with all these new Medicare plans, now we have more prior auths, we have more employees, we have more everything. So, bottom line is, we've been thrown a ball where we've got to take less revenue and we've got to spend more money to support that. And so that's just it's a non-sustainable growth at that point. So what changed? And we just talked about that. Between 20 and 25, we went from 34 to 54% of Medicare Advantage plans. 46, we're down to 46% now on traditional Medicare. And then you had a 30 to 40% increase on administrative costs, especially with prior auth. There's slower claim pay cycles. For Medicare, for what it is, we do know if the claim goes in clean, we're going to get paid in 15 days. Medicare Advantage plan, they'll do everything they can to not pay you. And if you are monitoring articles and things like this, I hate to see Aetna, Medicare, I'm not picking on Aetna, but that's the first thing that comes to my mind, but Aetna Medicare Advantage plan just got fined $400 million, okay? And they were upcoding hospital stays and all kinds of stuff. Well, the problem is they received $2 billion in revenue, and they paid a $400,000 penalty for that. So that sounds like pretty good business. If I can get $2 billion and only pay $400 grand, so big deal. That's the cost of doing business. But unfortunately, that's the world we live in, and we've got to understand that. So our operating margins are under pressure, and they've declined. And they've declined because of reimbursement, number one. Like we said, staffing, rent, administrative. And this, the second bullet, is a really key component. If you look back 4 or 5 years ago, infusion made up about 70%, sometimes 80% of a progressive practice's overall income. Well, that has dropped dramatically because of the decline in drug costs. I'm fighting with insurance companies constantly, and one of my big arguments with them is, okay, you want to pay us ASP plus some percent, but our expenses have gone way up. Now, if this, let's talk about Symphony Aria again. So let's say the average patient gets 3 vials of Symphony Aria. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, it was $3,000. Now it's a $1,500 infusion. The insurance company's costs have dropped 50% on expense on their side, but they don't want to increase our income based on our expenses going up. In the business world, that doesn't make sense to me. So you have to constantly be thinking about new ways to negotiate contracts, and that's one of them. Infusion revenue threats. We all know biosimilars. And I don't even know where to go with this. Years ago, I was asked, Ray, how long before we all go to sub-Q? And I said, I don't think we'll ever get all medicines being sub-Q because, some patients just can't tolerate things in other ways, and we'll always have infusion drugs. But what will that look like as a biosimilar down the road? I think what I have learned is when a biosimilar hits the market, you've got about 18 months on a biosimilar before it really tanks out and really it's underwater and you can't use it anymore. Avzola is a prime example of that now. And I still have groups reach out to me and I'll ask for some financial data and all that, and I'll look and they're still buying Avzola. And then I run the numbers and they are underwater $80,000 on Avzola, but they're still writing it. So I go to that carrier and say, okay, if you want us to use Avzola, it's no problem. You just got to increase what you're paying us because it's underwater. And if you don't want to use it, we'll send them over to the hospital and let the hospital use it. So you really have to break all of this down, just to the nth degree, and everywhere you're making or losing money, and it's difficult. You got to have the data to do all this. You've got to know what your margins are. We're going to talk about more of that in some other talks, but now payers are asking you to white bag or brown bag the drugs, which I'm totally against. If they want to do that, let them infuse it at their place. I'm all for physicians wanting to take care of their patients, but if you keep accepting everything these people throw at you, you won't be able to stay in business to take care of these patients. So that's why we've got to come up with a way to how can we stay in business and how can we do well? How can we still take care of these patients? A 2% difference in reimbursement on $10 million drug program is $200,000 a year. And that's not unheard of just to take a 2% hit. And that's a lot of money. Prior auth impact, thank goodness for AI. AI is changing a lot of that. I don't want to get too deep into this because we're going to talk about AI in another talk, but right now the people, how many people are using AI to do all of their prior auths? Just a few. So everyone else has employees doing it, correct? Yeah. So that's a huge expense, and I think that's one of our big opportunities that we'll be able to talk about and see where we can pull some revenue out of that. Let's see, billing and coding errors. So for years, I started in revenue cycle management in 1991. So I'm a lot older than I look. But that's, RCM is the lifeblood of what we do. And every time I go into a practice, most times, they've got some pretty unsophisticated people working in the billing department, and they don't have enough people. By the time you post charges, post payments, take all the phone calls, run the reports, do everything you can, by the end of the month, you're closing it out to start the next month, and your team doesn't even have time to work the AR. And that's where a lot of money is lost. And you guys, you know this, but how do you fix it? So when I talk to a group, probably there's two areas where they're missing revenue. Number one is in the billing department, and I've got several clients in here that we've taken over their billing and just really turned it around. And again, we'll get into another discussion about that. But we've got folks in this room that can attest to what we've done with that. But that's probably the biggest area for improvement that we look at is in the billing department. And I'll talk, we've got a great billing team. They've been here for years and years and years. They do everything right. They come in, and then when I go and finally look at it, I say, well, did you know all this? And then what hits the fan, and no, I did not know all this. Well, you don't know it because you don't get good reports. You don't watch the reports. You don't look and see what your AR days are. You're not managing your practice the way it needs to be managed. And it's not a failure on your part. It's a failure on what we do is extremely complicated. And you've got to have experts in all of these areas in order to bring this information forward. I'm good at what I think I'm good at. I'm really good at it. And the things I'm not good at, I have other people like Vicki and Scott and Elliot. We don't have one person that's great at everything. That person doesn't exist. There's a lot of people that think they're great at everything, but in reality it doesn't exist. So billing is probably the number one area that we see area for improvement. So, what is the traditional way to fix a problem in a medical practice? Well, you say, okay, we're having this problem. We're not getting the prior auths right. We have the AR is too big. So the number one way to fix that problem is we just hire another employee. And so I call that the Band-Aid, approach. The way to fix that problem is go to the root of the problem and find out what's going on, and then fix it at the root of the problem and not continue to throw money at it. The problem is, and I'm not picking on office managers because we love office managers. I was an office manager many years ago, and so I know what it's like. We work with the office managers to give them tools to help them take a lot of this burden off their back and let them focus more on the day-to-day stuff and let us do kind of the heavy lifting on this side. But if that office manager is not capable to figure out, hey, I've got to go and figure out what the root of the problem is and solve that, then you've got other issues there also. Physician productivity. This is an interesting conversation. So I am a proponent of a physician, especially a rheumatologist, so they're a rheumatologist. If they work an 8, 9-hour day, start seeing patients at 8, last patient at 4:40 or whatever, you cannot effectively see more than, depending on how many news you see, let's say you're seeing 3 news and the rest are follow-ups, you cannot see more than 20, 21 patients a day. I have physicians say, I see 37 patients a day. Well, I call that getting on the hamster wheel. Okay, I need more income, let's just see more patients. Well, that doesn't fix the problem. What that does is create more problems. And it creates more problems because you're always behind. You forget about things that you need to do with that existing patient. And then when a patient needs to go on biologic therapy, you don't have the time because you're an hour and a half behind to really sit down and talk to that patient about what's best for that patient. Is sub-Q best for that patient? You're going to explain that the drug will come to your house, you have to inject yourself, you have to deal with your prior auth, you have to deal with your insurance company, you have to do all that work. You have to make sure you inject yourself right, or you can come into the office, you're in and out in 45 minutes, depending on what drug and all that. We do all the prior auth for you, you just walk in and walk out. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit, but we're really talking about a little more. A lot of physicians don't know that it is a lot more expensive to put a patient on a sub-Q drug than it is an infusion drug. And the reason they don't know is because you can't find that information published. The only place you can find it published is if you go and look at you can go onto the CMS website and look at the drug, you can search for Medicare Drug B and Drug B dashboards. So you can see what Medicare pays per year for a patient on any drug that you list in there. And then you can do it for the medical benefit also. And to just give you a few examples off the top of my head, and I'll ask the audience, what do you think Medicare pays to have a patient on Enbrel or Humira?
$25,000.
How much?
$8,000.
$80,000 a year?
25.
25?
45.
45? 45 is going to be the winner. It's pretty close to 50. Okay. A vial of Remicade costs how much? $300. Okay. Average patient gets 5.7 vials of Remicade, right? 6, $1,800. So every infusion drug we have is cheaper than those two drugs. What's the number one drug in the world? Humira, right? So when you can't slow down and have these conversations, my wife is an infusion nurse. So we experimented on a lot of different things over the years. Make sure I'm watching my time here. So I can be very long-winded at times. But so we experimented with what the psychology was of a patient on sub-Q versus infusion and how that patient looked at it. So from a doctor's standpoint, it was, well, my patient's a white-collar worker. They live 45 minutes from the office. It's more convenient for them to be on sub-Q medicines. Okay, makes sense to me, right? Then we looked at what a person has to go through, and I don't know if any of your patients have had these conversations with you about how they hate getting the prior auth, how they hate, I've got to be home when my drug gets delivered. All these inconveniences for them. We don't know if the patient's injecting themselves properly. There's just a lot of things. We know that the best care for a patient is done inside of a physician's office. So my wife came up, and I don't give my wife credit for a lot of stuff, but I'm going to give her credit for this because I thought this was brilliant. She said, and Karen Hearn's in the audience back there in the back, she's our infusion manager for syrup, but we experimented with these things with Karen, and what we found out was when we talked a patient into changing over from sub-Q to infusion, the patient would say, why didn't you tell me about this years ago? Because it's so much easier for them and they like it. I've always said the infusion suite is the hair salon of healthcare. Okay? So you got Miss Jones in this chair and you got Sally in this chair, and they start talking and they're looking at the bag and they say, oh, you're taking a Rincy? Yeah, well, I'm taking a Rincy too. How long have you been taking it? So they all of a sudden are buddies. And then when you make this, say, all right, Miss Jones, when you want to make your appointment, on Wednesday, Thursday, and they make her appointment, and they say, okay, Sally, when do you want to make your, I want to come back with her. And so it creates almost a mini support system also. You know, and these are the little things we don't think about, but here's the thing I'm gonna give my wife credit for. She came home one day and she said, Ray, I think people who are on sub-Q have a level of disease and depression. And I said, what the hell are you talking about? She said, I had a patient tell me that every time I go into the refrigerator and open the door, I see my drug. And it reminds me of my disease. And I think about it all the time. And she said, she'd been on infusion for about 6 months, and she came in and she said, I do not think about my disease anymore until I get my notification that my appointment is 2 days from now. And then I think about it because I'm not seeing the drug, I'm not calling my insurance company. I didn't spend 5 hours on the phone trying to get my prior auth and all that. And I thought that's really interesting. So even though, to take this long story, even though there are issues that we're facing, there still are opportunities that we're not taking advantage of, and this is one of them. But the productivity, if you're not scheduled properly, you don't have time to do this. Weak payer contracting. I can't tell you how many practices I go into that have not negotiated their contracts since they originally signed them in 25 years ago. And the problem with that is if you take a contract with a payer like that and try to renegotiate it, and I want to bring it to current levels, they won't do it. They say, well, the most we can give you an increase, for is 4%. And then we can renegotiate 2 years from now and get another increase. And at 4% a year, it will never catch up to current market rates. So that's a big issue. A lot of people don't realize that, I was having this conversation last night with some docs, that they negotiate their payer contracts and they say, okay, well, we're going to come in on your codes that you use the most, we're going to give you 130% of Medicare on those codes. We're going to give you 100% on your lab codes. We're going to give you 80% on your radiology codes. They negotiate those. They say, well, what about the infusion codes? Oh, that's standard across the country. We don't negotiate those. Well, I'm calling BS on that because I negotiate them all the time. So, especially on drugs that are underwater, but you've got to have an angle. If you're in Florida and let's say you're in Orlando and there's 19 rheumatologists in Orlando and all of you are onesie, twosie docs, you got no power and no negotiating power. They will tell you right up front, hey, if the contract doesn't work for you, we've got plenty of coverage in that area, and so you've got to sign the contract. You're for, or you just don't take it. So where you get your contract power is by size, by scale. When you've got, and I'm going to use CIRA is a super group in Georgia with an office in Bluffton, South Carolina also. So when I go and negotiate contracts for them, in some areas there's not a lot of rheumatology coverage. So I've got a big advantage there, and I use that advantage when negotiating. But again, if you're a smaller group in an area where there's coverage, it's tough. I'm not saying it can't be done because we do it for Ross Casal over here in the corner. So Faraz and I have been negotiating his contracts. He's a single practitioner in Charlotte where there are a lot of physicians. But we do it very methodically. We have great letters that we send that we've created, and we've been able to move it. So it can be done. You just have got to you've got to have the skills to do it, and everybody does not have those skills. Oh, rising drug inventory risk. We find out when we go in and look at people's billing that there's so many drugs that were never paid, no prior auth. Dosage was more than the prior auth was given for. Leela, when you infuse a drug that's over, will they pay up to that amount, or they don't pay for the claim at all?
Depends on the payer.
Depends on the payer.
Sometimes they deny it all.
So there's all kinds of reasons that we uncover on why these claims weren't paid, and so And we even created an AI tool that we use a bot to go in that works with NextGen, where we can go in and check and see how many, I'll give you a big rundown of it real quick. So we can go and look at your schedule next week. Today's Saturday. Let's say we go and look at next Friday. So we can pull that, give you a pivot table back, and it will give all of your Medicare patients, it'll tell you how much the patient has outstanding, if there's any outstanding Medicare money, it will do it for the Blues, Aetna, Cigna, whatever on down the line. It will also tell you if there's prior auths, how many prior auths are left. If there's no prior auth available, it will tell you what the patient's copay is, what their coinsurance is, and now we're looking to make sure, because of new drugs, to make sure that that drug is on their formulary, and we're actually asking for the medical, we have to make sure that they approve that drug. So we're checking so much before that claim even goes out that there's a rare chance that that claim comes back and is not paid. So if you're not, checking all those things up front, and you've got to do it manually, and you've got to do it very detailed, then you run that risk of having that big drug debt inventory on your system, in your AR. Oh, one of my favorites. I cannot tell you how many offices I go into that don't even have a compliance plan. And I don't want to ask by show of hands, but HHS mandates that you have a compliance plan in place. And your compliance plan has to meet the 6 or 8 OIG standards. If you do not have that compliance plan in place, and you are found guilty of whatever audit they do, you pay treble damages. So if you've got a $150,000 clawback with no compliance plan, you're going to pay $450,000. And I don't know if you've noticed, but the OIG is probably at an all-time high right now. I follow the Georgia OIG. In Georgia, there was a rheumatology practice with several locations. They did not admit any guilt, but they just paid back $2.2 million to Medicare. Do you think they had a compliance plan? Nope. So I urge you, and don't go online and try to download a compliance plan. Our healthcare attorney is shaking his head no. So, you need to find a compliance expert. I personally think Sean Weiss is probably the best in the country in rheumatology. The group in Florida, Acevedo, she's pretty good. Sean is getting very busy. He's took a government appointment with HHS now, so he's extremely busy, but they have a big practice and they have more compliance people there. So make sure you have a compliance plan, get it set up, follow that compliance plan. Part of your compliance plan is to have your charts audited, and we typically, once a quarter, take 5 office visits and 5 infusion visits and have those audited by a compliance auditor who is credentialed in that, and then it comes back and gets scored. If you're below compliance, they'll do some training, and then you do it again, and if you're below 80% again, then they do what's called a pre-bill audit. So your charts have to be audited before they're even billed, because if you bill these and they're out of compliance, that's where you open yourself up for recovery. Practice consolidation. I'm all for practice consolidation if it's done the right way, where there's no 4 or 5 people making all the money and everybody else is a minion on that side. That doesn't work. It's already proven that doesn't work. I'm not a big fan of physicians being bought out by hospitals, because when you're a hospital employee, you work on RVUs. You do not get paid for your ancillary services, and that's just disaster there. I'm not big on PE money. PE wants to put things together where they can ramp it up, cut all the costs, and flip it and make money. That doesn't work for me. But being consolidated in different ways, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. There's several different ways to consolidate and work together and negotiate together. But that's kind of the way that I see how we're going to survive in the future. And many of you that have known me and have heard me talk on this subject, 5 years ago I said, or 6 years ago, I said by 2025, the onesie, twosie, threesie physicians will be few and far between because of pressures that are coming. Probably didn't happen that quick, but I think all of us can feel those pressures now, even in the big groups. Here's just some metrics that we ran. Revenue leakage, problem area, it's a 3 to 7% revenue impact, and depending on the size of your practice, these are amounts of money that can cost. And we're happy to do what we call benchmarking practice. We'll look and compare, and we'll de-identify the data. You won't know who we're comparing you to, and they won't know we're comparing you to them, or vice versa, or whatever. But we'll take groups in your same category, and let's look at what you do versus what they do, and let's figure out what you're doing right, what they're doing right, what you're doing wrong, what they're doing wrong, and let's learn from each other. Because I can promise you there are still groups in rheumatology that are doing very well. But they are watching everything to a penny. They have help. They have experts they're working with. And you can't do it all by yourself. More areas, Medicare fee schedule, we just talked about, commercial insurance pressure, biosimilar disruption. I think I actually had a talk with some higher ups at a biosimilar company that has many different products, and I was asking them about what their thought pattern was when they launched a biosimilar. And I said, knowing what I know and thinking of it from a business, from the business side, how would I launch it? I would say up front, okay, how long is our biosimilar really going to be relevant? Is it 18 months? Is it 24 months? They're launching it like it's going to be around for 5 years. Well, okay, it may be around for 5 years. Problem is, we used it all, the first 10 or 12, 15 months. We don't use it anymore. It's still around, but no one uses it because we can't make money with it. We can't buy and lose money. So I think there's a way to work together and do it in some size and go to one of these companies and say, hey, we can help you with this drug because it's a lower cost to the system. It's a good drug. We just got to get the economics right. And if we bring enough volume to them, they say, hey, all right, well, let's do a trial here and see if we can do it. But we've got to have some size to do it. Specialty pharmacy. I was approached several years back by Valerie Stiles. Most people know Valerie. Valerie and I go way back from our days at TSI. We've been friends forever. Andrew Backus is here now. Andrew and I have been friends forever. And when they first started, I looked at the numbers and I said, this doesn't work. It's just not making enough money. And then slowly she called me every 6 months, and finally they had enough contracts. Okay, well now it's starting to be real money. So we took a flyer and we've got some groups on it. We've negotiated some different things. You can come to House RX under TLR and it's cheaper than going to them direct because of our volume, so we use that volume. But also we use that volume in negotiating with pharma too on that side. So, that's another way, an avenue that groups can work together under a different model. So, let's look at the focus area 1, 2, 3, and 4, because this is pretty telling. Focus area group, strong leadership, accurate financial data, service line, business acumen, decision making, clear profitable metrics. 2, better, it just keeps going down and down. We go down to focus area 4, selective growth investments. Hold on, I think I did this wrong. This is if you want to be a good practice. Focus area 1 is your leadership. Next is your negotiating structure. Next is launch and integrate what you put together, and then scale and optimize it. I've got another slide that talks about, what the problems are in different levels too. So, identify what your problems are, figure out how to solve them, then implement that, make them operational, and then grow from that also. Signs your practice are at risk. Your operating margins are below 20%. That number varies a little bit depending on whether you have x-ray and lab, research, some other variables in there. Your prior office consuming one FTE with no dedicated specialist. Infusion chair utilization, that's a big one, and we can go into that conversation very, very deep. But we see a lot of infusion practices just not optimizing their chair turn. And it all has to do with scheduling. Succession planning, productivity declining year after year, and facing competition from the hospitals. Okay. Signs that your practice is adapting to all these changes, you're unwilling to compromise, dedicated prior auth team, infusion profitability, you have a tracker that you know what you're making on. I hear people say, okay, well, we're making $1,200 a Symphony injection. Well, how do you know? Well, okay, well, ASP is this, our cost is this, that's $1,200. Okay, well, are you collecting that $1,200? That's what you look at. You don't look at what the margin is, because if you don't collect it, you don't make that margin. Key takeaways, the financial equation has fundamentally shifted, where years ago you could, mess up here and there and still be financially adequate. Now you cannot do that. You've got to watch every nickel and dime. Medicare Advantage now covers 54%. By going to House RX, we are able to take many of those Medicare Advantage patients and clear bag their infusion through House RX and infuse them in our practices. So that's been a big boost. Total potential financial impact of common operational problems can be $1.7 to $3.7 million annually. And that just depends on the size of your practice. If a one physician practice, if I told them, I said, hey, we can increase your income next year $250,000. I mean, that's substantial because that's all going bottom line to that physician. Practices that are thriving have strong leadership, they have better payer contracts, they're aggressive on their infusion management, staffing efficiency, and tighter overhead control. I remember years ago, doctors saying, now, I don't want to put all my patients on infusion because it looks like I'm doing it to make money. And that could have been true for some physicians back then. Today, if you're putting a patient on infusion, you're saving money to the system. You're giving that patient better service, better outcome. It's not that way, and if you're still thinking that way, you've got to change that. Practices that adapt now by optimizing operations, renegotiating contracts, investing the right infrastructure will still maintain that 25 to 35% margin. And we've got practices that are still doing that in spite of all the challenges that we faced. All right, any questions? Oh, come on. Ooh, that's going to be bad for us, isn't it? That's going to get work.
Yeah, I was asking what you think about the consolidation of insurance companies and the impact that'll have on consolidation of groups and development of super groups.
Man, my gut feeling would be consolidation of insurance would be bad for us. And then if that happens, the next thing they're going to do is try to buy up groups. Then you're going to be working for the person who collects the money from your patient and gives you your check, which is not going to be good. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's terrible. I think that more providers should be focused on that vertical integration in the insurance industry where they own the pharmacy, the practice, and the payer. I think that's being looked at more from an antitrust perspective, but that's something folks should educate themselves on and be wary of.
Morning, Ray.
Morning.
Thanks for inviting us today.
Glad you're here, Dr.
What do you think about a hybrid practice where you have direct care that's capitated in addition to traditional?
My honest opinion is, I think if we're having to get to that point, then we've got other problems that we need to fix that would force us to get to that point. I don't, I've been asked many times, is rheumatology going to be, like another MD-VIP? I don't, unless you're in Los Angeles, New York City, you got to be in real high density areas where you've got people with a lot of money and that'll pay $300 a month, to get those services and all that. I think there are a few services we could offer to get paid for, but I've always been, these are the things that we do that we should focus on. And if we have to get outside of that to make ends meet, then we're not focusing on these things that are here. It's just my honest opinion. So now that we've talked about, what the issues are, the rest of the sessions, we're going to introduce some people on our staff and kind of let them tell you what they do. But now we're going to start saying, okay, how do we dive into these numbers? How do we get the numbers? How do we see what we're doing? And then how do we start fixing that problem? So I'm giving you the bad news, and then hopefully the rest of the talks will be good news and how we make this happen. Thanks, everyone.